Hello and welcome back. This is the fourth video, the penultimate video, the second to last video in my series on the stitches that I used to make my very long scroll, and I'm glad to see you back and welcome to all of the new viewers. It's nice to see so many of you interested in how I made this scroll. And what am I wearing today? I'm wearing an altered shirt that I added all kinds of stitches to. It was an insane project. This took a long time. It's hand stitched all over using mainly running stitch and a few other stitches. It started with a plain pink shirt and it's got all sorts of other embroideries and things that I've cut off, tablecloths and all kinds of stuff attached to it. Maybe one day I'll show you how I made this, but today I would like to show you a stitch that I was intimidated by for a very long time. It's called my mind completely went blank. It is called French knot. That's how much I was intimidated by this stitch for such a long time. I can't even remember what it's called. I blocked it. No, I can do French knots now, but they can be fiddly. So let me show you how I make French knots. So, French knots, they're not actually as hard as I've been making them out to be. And if you've been practicing the knot that I showed in the first video, you'll be well set for making them. So here's how it works. Just like all the other stitches, you bring your thread up to the front of your fabric, and now you wrap the thread around your needle 2 or 3 times, and you go back into the same hole that you came out from. And then you pull the thread very slowly through that stitch. And there you go, you've got a beautiful little French knot there. Now let's do that again. Now this stitch works best if you wrap those threads around your needle really close to the point where the thread comes up to the front of the fabric. You can do it further away, but you're likely to run into some problems, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And oh, this is one of the problems that you're likely to run into. You get your thread all pulled all the way through and there's still a loop on the front. Now sometimes you can gently work that out like I'm doing here and end up with a French knot, but sometimes this doesn't work out. And I'll show you in a few minutes when I show you how I use the French knot, how that happens. So here's my first use for a French knot. And I'll start here by adding some French knots onto my tree here to further disguise that hard line that I have going across. And I talked about this little tree in my last video, and I've added a piece of cloth so you can see the join quite clearly. And I'm adding more and more stitches on top of the tree that look like, I don't know, leaves, berries, different things to try to disguise that line across the middle there. And I'm not worrying about whether it looks great right now. The more stitches I add, the more disguised the line will become. And now the next place that I'm going to add some stitches, I'm going to add some clusters of French knots here on top of this plant that I made in a previous video. And this time I'm blending the colors of threads. I'm working with 3 strands of thread, 2 pink and 1 sort of pale purple to start with, and I'm creating a cluster of French knots. When you create a cluster, it doesn't really matter if each one is perfect. You can't see individual knots. And here you go. Here's another example of what I mentioned before. I've got this little loop here that I couldn't pull out. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to disguise it. I'm going to bunch all those threads together and start stitching over top so it just looks like a little cluster of a rather exuberant little flower here. And I'm not going to worry about it. If that loop had been bigger, I might have been able to cut it off and pull the tails through to the back. But that loop was fairly small, so all I could really do is disguise it, because here's the thing. You can't cut out a knot like that when you're doing French knots. You have to take all of the knots out and start over. So creating a cluster like this is a really good place to start practicing French knots. And here I'm just adding lots and lots and lots of French knots, lots of practice here. And this is not fast. I've got those videos sped up quite a bit. It takes a long time, so you can get lots of practice doing French knots this way. And I had a really good question from somebody the other day. Somebody asked me, how do they make their stitches look more organic and less precise? I imagine that they learn to do embroidery and things in a very formal, structured way. And how do you stop doing that? And that's a really good question. So I have a question back for you. What is the difference between something that's made by a human being and something that's made by a machine? So what do you think? What is the difference? So we have machines that do things for us really well. They can repeat things. Once you've made your design, they can crank out hundreds, thousands, probably by the millions. What do we do well as human beings? We make things original, one of a kind. So I would like to really encourage people to stop following instructions, stop using templates, and create your own designs. Create things that are made by your hand. And you can do this. I don't have any templates here. None of this is realistic. It's all imaginary. And you can do this too. It does not take skill or talent. It just takes the ability to give it a try. And please do try. I'd love to see what you make. So here, what am I doing here? Oh, I'm still working on those French knots, and every time I start with a new thread, I've varied the combination of colors that I've used. I've used more pink in some areas and more purple in some areas, and that gives this cluster of little flowers here a nice blended effect. This section, creating the centers for these daisy flowers, is probably something that's better done after you've practiced the stitch a bit. Once you feel confident making your French knots, you can absolutely go in here and add the centers to your flowers. And if you don't feel confident, then find a different creative way to create a center for the flower. Take some straight stitches over top of each other and make your flower centers that way. It's all good. So now I'd like to show you a variation on the French knot called the pistil stitch. And this stitch looks like a mashup between a straight stitch and a French knot. So you start out the same as you would for your French knot. You will wrap your threads around your needle, but then instead of taking that stitch really close to where you've come up through the cloth, you'll move your needle a little ways away, so you get kind of a long tail with a knot on the end. And let's see how I've used that in my landscape here. So here I'm going to make a small cluster to resemble some short little plants with a little knob at the top. And what is that needle? Why do I have so many needles stuck into my cloth? I don't know. But let's move that out of the way so that my thread does not get caught up on it, because that's the reason I don't use pins, because my thread gets caught up on them. But so why do I have a needle there? I know there are a lot of people who like to do things in odd numbers. I don't think it matters. Do things in odd numbers, even numbers, whatever you like. And now what am I going to do? I'm going to combine my French knots with chain stitch. And the chain stitch is something that I did in a previous video. But just like I did with the pistil stitch, I can create a chain stitch, and I need to take basically a straight stitch to secure the chain stitch, and I can add a little knot to the end of that. So this little plant here is getting some extensions with knotted chain stitch. You can add the knot to all kinds of stitch. In the next video, I'll be showing you another stitch that I use quite a bit, which is called the fly stitch, and you can add French knots to the end of that. And again, adding these individual stitches to make up a plant or a tree or a mass of color, as you can see, takes a lot of time, which is why I started adding the little bits of cloth into the background, because then you can just add a few decorative embroidery stitches on top and you get the impact off the colored cloth, as well as the texture and variation created by the stitches. As you can see in my tree here, I've added more stitches onto it, and I think it looks pretty good. I don't think you really notice that line across the stitch unless you really look. And once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, which will be on fly stitch and feather stitch, two variations on a theme there.